Hi there, it's Marla at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam continues to work through Exodus 34 and speaks about God's anger. Can we trust that God's anger is just and proportionate? What does our anger look like in comparison to God's anger? Enjoy the third message in the God Has a Name series.
So, if you've not been with us ever before, the chances are you never will again. Let me just kind of get us up to speed of where we've been. We're in this series called God Has a Name, and to be honest with you, it's pretty heady material, and therefore we're trying to lighten it up a little bit and be creative with it, and James is a genius and lots of fun, so thanks for those of you who are part of that. But just by way of kind of here's where we've been and here's where we're going, and I think sometimes what happens is life happens and you don't have to admit it to me, but you're like, I forgot the sermon from last week. So this is kind of, if you've never been here or if you just need kind of a spur forward or whatever, we do have a team that works really hard on podcasts. You can always access those. But we started with what I think are a couple important questions, not just for this series, but for what it means to be a God-associated person. We started by asking this question of, what if it's essential, what if it's important that people like me acknowledge that to speak of God is dangerous? In fact, what if places like this, and if nothing else, it would be ironic, what if it's important that we have this kind of collective psyche that says it's important that places like this acknowledge that to speak definitively to who God is and what God is like and what God's will is and what makes God laugh and what makes God angry is dangerous business. And again, dangerous doesn't mean not worthwhile. Lots of things that are worthwhile are also very dangerous, but dangerous in the sense of you can get yourself in some trouble and you can lead yourself down a path that you probably didn't intend to go down. What if it's important that people like yourself, whether you're someone that's been steeped in the Bible for decades or someone who's never read from the Bible, whether you're a Christ follower or a secular humanist, what if it's important that people like you acknowledge that to speak of God is dangerous? And it's dangerous if for no other reason than the reality is that any time we try to give something definition, in a sincere attempt to know God accurately and personally, if we're not careful, we trivialize God. We oversimplify God. God is by definition other and mysterious and outside of ourselves, and therefore many a well-intentioned, spiritually minded people on a genuine pursuit to know God accurately and personally have actually oversimplified him. In fact, many of you have, for the last couple of weeks, been carrying around one of these plastic ninjas in your pocket, 200 of you-ish. Either that or you were looking to get something for your kids for Christmas and you just stole these. But we have lots of silly ideas. Most of the time they fall flat. But a couple hundred of you have taken one of these around. And the invitation was to carry this around in your pocket throughout this series, which will end Thanksgiving weekend. And I'm very excited for Thanksgiving weekend. That one's going to be a lot of fun. As just this kind of perpetual reminder that the act of theology is dangerous. That the act of theology, if we're not careful, actually whittles God down to a size that is embarrassingly small, and that many a well-intentioned Christ followers or spiritually minded people, it quickly becomes not about knowing that God will be with us in our future, but actually predicting the future. It becomes not about knowing God and having a relationship with God, but controlling God, or even controlling others with our views of God. So we started there, and we did so because this is a series where we're going to talk about God's self-proclaimed character, and so we said, wait a minute, first we need to acknowledge that what we speak of when we speak of God is dangerous stuff. But then that leads to this second idea, and it's this. What if simultaneously it's dangerous to say I don't have any views of God? Again, whether you're a secular humanist or of some other religion or a nominal Christ follower or very devout in your Christ-following nature, what if it's very important that you acknowledge that, listen, what we believe about God drives how we live? That the reality is everyone from the ISIS militant to the fundamentalist, to the protester, to you and I, very few things impact the lives that we live more than do our views of God. And so it's this kind of twofold thing that on the one hand, this is dangerous. But on the other hand, to say that you don't have views of God is just as dangerous because you do, and they drive the way you live. Part of what I respect about the medical field and the teaching field and many others is you don't get to get your degree and then say you're done learning for the rest of your life. It would be malpractice if you're a real estate agent who doesn't get your continuing ed credits. Why then is it that in a genuine pursuit of Jesus, we have this tendency to go, wait a minute, you figure it out by 16, and then you clench really strong and try to just maintain that until you die? What if that's dangerous? So that's where we started, and that led us to this arbitrary, ironic thing, but we do this because we're a Christ-following community centered around Jesus in the text. That doesn't mean you have to believe that to be a part of this with us. It just means like that's at our core who we are. We turn to Exodus 34, where God and Moses had a unique interaction. And God answered Moses' question when Moses said, hey, what's your name? He really said, like, show me your glory. This is this ancient Semitic way of saying, what's your name? And God answers with an answer that is not only the first instance of his name, but that section of Scripture where God describes what his name means is the most quoted, referenced, sung about, argued about, believed, disbelieved text in all the Bible. Jesus, the Psalms, the prophets, everywhere in the Bible, it's the most quoted section there. And so that's why we're like, well, let's take a look at what this says God's name means. So Exodus 34. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now, clearly there's some stuff in there that's troubling that we would generally avoid. I would generally avoid. Part of what I've said is if you can handle it or if you can manage it, please be here for every part of the series because it would be toxic to pick and choose parts of God's self-proclaimed definition and leave behind others. So, almost done with this long, lengthy introduction. Last week we talked about compassion, that the word comes from the female womb, that it's a feeling word, that God goes, and you can grab this on podcast if you care, that God goes, hey, I like you. I feel about you the way a mother feels for her newborn child. Gracious is a valiant God, a God who will get up in the middle of the night and do what we need, a God who is for us. This week, I want to look at that next bit that starts some of the uncomfortable stuff, a God that is slow to anger. Now, in the Hebrew, it looks like this. Go ahead to that next slide, which means nothing to any of us because I don't speak Hebrew and you don't speak Hebrew, but sometimes we pretend. I won't not even ask you to butcher the pronunciation because I wouldn't know if you were right or wrong because I've so far successfully avoided original language classes at this point in my seminary tenure. But here's what I want you to see. If you were to translate those two words literally, here's what it means. Go ahead. Long nostrils. Of is, of course, something, like if you were to literally translate it, it means long nostrils, which I know that as you've pictured Jesus, I mean, you never pictured the bathrobe and the blue Miss America sash or any of that stuff. You've always pictured a guy with a big nose, right? Where the heck does this come from? First of all, it speaks to, we got to be careful when we translate the Bible because we're still taking other cultural concepts and translating them to our language. That's a Semitic, picturesque language. God says to Moses, Moses, you need to understand, I have a womb, I'm for you, and I have a big nose. But think about this. When you watch somebody or when you yourself lose your temper, think of what happens to your face. You take a big gulp of air, your nostrils flare, and you begin to verbally berate your victim, right? Now think of how that's different when you watch somebody with great expertise keep their cool, practice patience, be slow to anger. Think of how different it is. Your lips purse, they stay shut, and you take a deep breath from where? Through your nostrils. See, the picturesque language would say, if you're going to be a patient person, that means you're going to have mastered the art of breathing through your nose. And so God says to Moses, Moses, I have a really big nose. Watch this in Proverbs. It shows up twice in the book of Proverbs, which is this book of collective wisdom from the Hebrew culture in chapter 14. So this phrase only shows up 2 times in Proverbs. Here's one. Whoever is patient, there's your phrase. Whoever has a big nose or big nostrils has great understanding. But one who is quick-tempered displays folly. Now you've seen this. You've seen how patience proves to be the higher form of valor, haven't you? 16:32, watch this. Better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. There again, your word patient. I love the way John Mark Comer, to whom I'm indebted for a lot of the research here, here's the way he says it. He says, you can make God mad, but you'll have to work really hard at it. Now, this is pause there for a second. Last week, we talked about 1500 BC, and I asked you with tortilla shells and grapes and lots of awkward stuff. I'm glad to see that you came back. Go to that next slide. What we talked about was it's important that we imagine that we were Hebrews living in 1500 BC who just left Egypt, because their world is different than our world, and the Bible's written for us but not to us. It was written to people in a culture, and we need to somehow translate that culture there. And what we talked about is Moses was writing to a culture that was pregnant with gods and goddesses, and those gods and goddesses were angry. They hated people. People weren't even human unless you were a king or a queen. You were there to do the gods' bidding. Sacrifices was about appeasing the wrath of the gods. Part of what we wanted to talk about last week was a God who leads with, who says, my primary emotion is I like you and I for you, is foreign. And a God who says I'm slow to anger, even more foreign. But here's what happens to us. I wonder if we're so uncomfortable with the idea of a God that gets angry that we don't see the slow, we just get locked onto the angry part. To be honest with the text is to go, wait a minute. The original audience would have been blown away by the notion of a God who doesn't fly off the handle unpredictably all the time. Now, this means two things. First of all, it means God is slow to anger. Go ahead to that next slide. It means God gets there slowly, methodically. This morning is a good reminder that we have a kids team that works really hard to create age-appropriate experiences, because what I want to do is show you a clip that's very uncomfortable for all of us, maybe uncomfortable for your kids because of the language. The irony to me is we would be comfortable watching it at home, but not in church. We could have that conversation sometime else if you want. But I want to show you this clip because what it captures is Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the night, meeting with his cabinet, debating the necessity of the 13th Amendment. And I just want to invite you to watch a guy who's slow to anger. Go ahead, let's hit that clip.
Our members to a fairly well. You've had no defections from the Republican right to trouble you. Whereas to what you promised, where the hell are the commissioners?
Oh, my God. It's true. You lied to me, Mr. Lincoln. You evaded my request for a denial that there is a Confederate peace offer because there is one. We are absolutely guaranteed to lose the whole thing.
We don't need a goddamn abolition amendment. Leave the Constitution alone.
The peace commissioners appear today or
state by state
on the
you can
morning.
I can't listen to this anymore. I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war. And whether any of you or anyone else knows it, I know I need this. This amendment is that cure. We're stepped out upon the world stage now. With the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment. Now. And you grousel and heckle and dodge about like pettifogging Tammany Hall hucksters. See what is before you. See the here and now. That's the hardest thing. The only thing that accounts. Abolishing slavery by constitutional provision settles the fate for all coming time, not only of the millions now in bondage, but of unborn millions to come. 2 votes stand in its way. These votes must be procured.
We need 2 yeses, 3 abstentions, or 4 yeses and 1 more abstention, and the amendment will pass.
You got a night and a day and a night, several perfectly good hours. Now get the hell out of here and get him.
Yes. But how?
Buzzard's guts, man. I am the President of the United States of America, clothed in immense power. You will procure me these votes.
Question. What if our struggles with a God who's angry is more a reflection of our misuse of anger than his? You know? What if watching a guy use anger the way we just watched Lincoln, what if that's rare? Did you sense a person who's flying off the handle? Did you sense that he had or had not thought about this moment? I get the sense that he sat there for some time before he went there. What if God gets angry, but what if he's slow to anger? And what if part of what's going on here is God saying to Moses, Moses, that God who sits up in the clouds and throws lightning bolts at any little mistake, that's not me. But don't confuse this with the fact that I'm slow to anger, right? There's two ways to see that phrase. There's two places where we can put emphasis. One is on the slow, and the other is on the anger part. The irony here is if we were to compile a list of things that most disillusion us about God, things that would most create pause as to opening the scriptures, things that would cause those that we do life with to never want to come check out church with us or have a conversation about Jesus, I'm going to guess it's the accurate and inaccurate views of God's wrath that's at the very top of the list, isn't it? A God who gets angry is incredibly uncomfortable. I wouldn't have considered any of this either were it not for a series. I think part of the value of studying the Bible this way on occasion is it forces us to abide in some things that are very there, they're very strong, they're very repetitive, but they're very uncomfortable. God's anger, his wrath, comes up 600 times in the text. Let's just look at a few. Please don't get up and leave during this. Please hear me out. This would be tragic to just suspend judgment for a few moments, will you? Psalm 7. God is a righteous judge, a God who displays his wrath every day. He does not relent. He will sharpen his sword. He will bend and string his bow. He has prepared his deadly weapons. He makes ready his flaming arrows. I mean, a God with a bow, a God with a sword, a God with flaming arrows, a God with a weapons depot. What if this God can become very, very angry? Psalm 5, verse 7, the arrogant cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong. This is a lot different than the simplistic God is love thing, isn't it? Psalm 11, verse 5. The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. Wait a minute. Where is the love piece of this? It's important that we pause and go, what is he hating on? Is it people or is it violence? Is it hurt? Let me ask you this. Does it not make God more real? That a terrorist who walks into a mall laced with explosives and kills innocent people, that God hates that behavior? Does it not make sense that God would grieve that people are now contemplating whether or not to check out a church based upon whether or not there's going to be a shooting there? Does it not make sense that God hates the pedophile known as uncle, or the date rapist who goes completely unknown and unpunished? Does it not make sense that God hates the heroin dealer who would never him or herself use the drug, but makes no bones about selling it to our kids? Does it not make God more real? What if when we beat the table and go, this isn't right, God joins us in that and says, you're right? And if part of Moses' what he's doing here, if part of what God is doing through Moses here is going, listen, I'm not an idea. I think one of the hardest things about religion is moving from this idea that God is an idea to the fact that God is a person who experiences emotions and in spades. We're going to talk more about that in February. Does it not make God more real? That he would have these strong emotional responses to some of these horrific things? And I wonder, what if part of the problem is projection? What if part of the problem is I know how inept I am in my use of anger? I've been mistreated by anger. I've mistreated others with anger. And therefore I project that that's what God does. What if God doesn't roll like that? John Stott says it this way. Let's go to that slide. John Stott said, God's wrath is his steady, unrelenting, unremitting, uncompromising antagonism to evil in all its forms and manifestations. Now, let's just think about your anger, my anger versus God's anger. Maybe yours is not like mine, but let's just go to that next slide. See, my anger is almost always narcissistic. How about you? Go ahead. Can we trust that God's anger doesn't come from a selfish, narcissistic place? My anger is almost always disproportionate. And I think one of the things my kids will need therapy for, go ahead to the next slide, is the fact that sometimes the consequences just don't fit the crime. It's just, you get so irrational. Like, you didn't make your bed, you're not going to eat food for a month. I mean, that's a horrible example. But right, like, you do these kind of like, what? How do those two things connect together? I don't get it. Can we trust that God's anger is just? That it's proportionate? One of the refrains throughout, especially the poetry of the text, is let justice roll down like a river. Let God's justice get the last word. My anger's always rushed. How about you? It's never calculated. It's always in a hurry. Go ahead to that next slide. It's always like I'm always running into it. Can we trust that God doesn't roll that way, that it's on tempo? That it's a part of wisdom? What if part of our problem here is the way we project one to the other? Now, that doesn't undo the fact that God's wrath is all over the place in the text, 600 times. Go ahead to that next slide. So what do we do with this? This is going to get weird. Last week was weird. I thought we might as well stay in the weird vein. But I want to create a visual here, because when I was researching this, there was something that was pointed out to me by way of a quadrant that helped me go like, do you have a pet peeve with generalization? Do you ever have that? Like, I used to work for somebody who you just never generalized, which is itself a generalization. But, like to go like, even to this day, I was with him recently, and like if someone says all churches or all Christians or all nurses or all teachers, he's like, wait a minute, who are we talking about? Oh, I know 3. Okay. I think we do that when we talk about God's wrath. That what we miss is the text isn't one-dimensional when it comes to God's wrath. There are several different types of wrath, and they can all be illustrated, but some occur in a much larger abundance than do others. So to illustrate all this, I need 4 of you who'd be willing to come on the stage and sit on a chair. I'm not going to ask you to do anything weird or say anything, because I'm a narcissist and I have the microphone. I don't want you to have it. So would 4 of you come to the stage real quickly, please? And I got to get some stuff. Not everybody at once. I'll turn my back, so as you decide. This is a very successful illustration, I see. Thank you. It was awesome. Last service, Kyle Ball totally got shown up because all of his in-laws came to the stage and he stayed seating. Hi, Tanley. Thanks. So will you climb the ladder like to the 3rd rung and just stand there and look like your awesome Tanley self? And then, hi, Colleen. Thanks. Hi. No, are you Colleen? You're Colleen? I'm also Colleen. Wow. So you can have that spot, and then Colleen, I'm going to give you a spot over here. And then, does I see Jeremiah coming up? Perfect. So you can sit there, Colleen, and somewhere I have, who stole my stool? Is it over here? Oh, thanks. Okay, so Colleen, or Jeremiah, you're going to be right there. It'd be so much more dramatic if you were up there, all of your stature. Okay, so what I want to go ahead to that next slide. You know the whole like 4-quadrant thing? We could have just done this on paper, but it sounded so boring. So what I want to do is try to represent it for you. So will you hold that? So God's wrath in the text, it often has a present component to it, which means someone sins, someone does something, and boom, God's wrath happens then and there. It's in the text. Not as much as God's future wrath. Oftentimes the way God's wrath works is God going, if you don't, then this thing's going to happen in the future. Oftentimes an army or something will come along and wreak havoc on Israel, but it's not today, it's 150 years later. So there's a present and there's a future component, that kind of horizontal line. There's also an active component. So there are times when God is very involved in it. There are times when in this very moment, there's an example of this in the Old Testament. I think it's in Kings with a guy named Uzzah. You may or may not know that when the tabernacle went mobile, the idea was that when you take the Holy or the Ark of the Covenant with you, which was this very symbolic thing, very important to their religious background, it had these golden rings on the sides, and you put poles in the side of it. And the idea was that when the tabernacle goes mobile, the Ark of the Covenant is moved very, very carefully. Some of our liturgical traditions represent this well, like with the priest walking down with the Bible. It's this very methodical thing. One time, Israel was pretty haphazard and pretty flippant, and they threw it on a cart, and the cart was behind an animal. I think it was an ox. And as they're kind of bumping along down the road, the ark starts to fall, and it starts to fall off, and a guy reaches out to keep it from touching the ground, and Uzzah touches it, and boom, it says God's wrath burned against him, and he died right then and there. There are times when God's wrath is very active and very present. And if we're being honest, those are the times that get all the airtime. When you're talking to a friend who just can't do the Jesus thing, can't do the church thing, used to do the church thing, those are the moments that stop, and they're there. They're in Acts. It's not just an Old Testament thing. The active presence of God involved in wrath, it's very there. There's a future side. There's that side. The future side, it's this idea of judgment, and we get really uncomfortable here. Oftentimes when God is talking about his wrath, he's saying, in the future, if you don't, this thing's going to happen to you. You know, we're coming out of the 20th century. What we all know now is the most violent century, at least on record. It was driven in large part by guys like Karl Marx, who said religion is the opium of the masses. And that's not to say that religion doesn't create its own violence. But one Polish poet, who lived through this, he experienced communist Russia, he experienced Nazi Germany. Listen to the way he says it. Go ahead to that slide. He says, the true opium for the people is believing in nothingness after death. The huge solace of thinking that for our betrayal, our greed, our cowardice, our murders, we are not going to be judged. And then there's a passive component. So you with me? There's this horizontal, there's present and there's future. There's active and there's passive. Oftentimes, it's passive. You see Israel getting destroyed by a foreign army, and it's not God who's in the chariot. It's God going, I'm going to get out of the way, and this army is going to wreak havoc on your country. Paul uses this phrase. Paul will often say in his writing, God turned them over to their sin. It's God's passive wrath. It's God going, like parents sometimes have to do. Okay, you want to play fast and loose with that? I guess the only thing I can do is get out of the way and see where this goes. God's passive wrath it's the person who plays fast and loose with pornography, and the next thing they know, they lose their marriage. It's the parents who play fast and loose, maybe with their business accounting, and the next thing you know, they find themselves in the midst of a scandal. It's the drug addict who suddenly finds themselves dealing with lots of physical challenges because of the drug abuse. It's the employee who doesn't give an honest day's work and suddenly finds himself without work. It's not God actively punishing. It's God getting out of the way and going, okay, we'll just see where this takes you. But here's what I think is very important. They're all represented in the text, but it's not proportionate. Lots of them some of them don't happen very much. Some of them happen a whole bunch. So here's what I want to do, is the passive future. Will you go hang out over there? This is like, I know it's like elementary school, right? And active, will you come over here? Thanks, Tanley. If we're being honest, the vast majority of the instances of God's wrath are happening. Oh, did I mix it up? Yeah, no, sorry. Now that I could create a theological quandary. They happen like this. Passive in the present. Okay. And active in the future. You're going to answer. And things could get dicey. And oftentimes it's 150 years later. But who cares? I think we have to, unless you were really struggling and needing an apologetic on God's wrath, who cares? Let me ask you this. This is the part for me as a parent and as just a leader, this was super challenging for me. What if anger is a tool? You know, we often put it in the category of emotions that we're just better off never experiencing. What if that's not the way God made us? What if anger is a tool like any tool? Like put in the hands of somebody who's unwise and lacks self-control? Every one of us could tell stories of the damage that could be done with the stupid use of anger. And yet hopefully you have some examples of leaders or parents who have used anger well, who have used it like an expert would use a tool, and they've done some beautiful things with it. What if our struggle with God's wrath says more about us than him? What if the real struggle is we are so void of positive examples of anger, and we ourselves are so inept that we project our struggle with anger onto God? What if it says more about us than him? And what if the life God's inviting us into, apprenticeship with Jesus, is not this like, Lord, don't make me angry? I don't know where that comes from. It was so a part of my early evangelical experience where there's this idea of when you would lose your temper and you'd kind of acknowledge that to somebody, the prayer was always pray to God and he'll take away your anger. What if that's not the way God thinks about this? Look at James 1:19. Will you go to that slide? This is Jesus' half-brother, one of the early writings we have. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Where's that come from? Well, God has a long nose. He has big nostrils. What if God's goal for you is not that you would never experience anger, but that you would have the kind of divinely infused emotional intelligence that you know how to use it the way an expert surgeon wields their scalpel? And what if we do well to stand back from all of the struggles with God's emotion and go, wait a minute, how am I doing with my own? I'd like to pray and we're going to wrap it up. God, thank you. Thanks, Lord, for scholars and thinkers who take 30,000-foot views of Scripture and help us stop generalizing some of our struggles. Thanks, God, that you are a God of justice. You know the stories of abuse. You know the stories of hurt. You know the way we pound our fist and ask why. And God, it doesn't have to make sense to us if we know that somehow that the justice makes sense to you. But God, more than that, I pray as parents, as spouses, as friends, as roommates, as teammates, as classmates, that you'd make us the type of people, types of apprentices of yours, Jesus, that aren't looking to escape the emotion of anger, but understand what it looks like to honor you with its use. Would you give us a kind of anger that's calculated, that's proportionate, that's just, that's on tempo, that's not easily offended, that's not narcissistic, but does go to battle for the right things. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.